And get a Bible out, open up to 1 Samuel, and we are in this study looking at King David and about how King David is atypical, meaning that he's not normal, right? He doesn't do things like the other people that are around him. David is atypical because David is a man who knows. David is a man who knows that if he stands up for God, God will do what? If he stands up for God, God will stand with him. Right? And so last week we looked at the point, and we pointed out that Israel, when they came into the promised land, Israel was supposed to be the kingdom of God. Who was their king? God was supposed to be their king, right? When they came into the promised land, they didn't have a human king. They were ruled by this list of warrior prophets that are called judges. That's what we read about when we get to the book of Judges. The last one was Samuel, and so when the prophet Samuel grew old, the people began complaining that they didn't have a king like the other nations. What were they complaining about? They didn't have a king like the other nations. Well, that statement was correct, because they did have a king, and their king was better than the king of the nations. They had a king, and their king was the maker and sustainer of the universe. They had the one and only true ruler as their king. They already had a king who led them into battle and won their victories for them. See, their king was God. Their king was Yahweh Almighty. He already led them into battle. He already defeated their enemies for them. But they weren't happy with that. They wanted a human king, a king like the other nations. The first king that was chosen by Samuel was this guy named Saul. And Saul was an impressive looking man, right? He was the best looking guy around. He was a head taller than everybody else in Israel. And Saul became king, but instead of letting God rule through him, what got in the way? Saul's ego got in the way, didn't it? His ego began getting in the way, and that resulted in God rejecting Saul and his kingship, and then God sends Samuel to anoint this young man who actually was the opposite of Saul. He was the opposite of Saul in his physical appearance. He was also opposite of Saul in the condition of his heart. We're talking about David, a man who knows. What does he know? If he stands up for God, God will what? God will stand with him. This is the thing that makes David different from Saul. David loved God. Saul loved himself. So as we go through this story, one of the things that we see is that even though God rejects Saul as king, Saul doesn't just automatically step down, does he? He doesn't just automatically lose his throne. Saul goes on as king, but he loses something. He loses his spark. He loses his edge. He loses his mojo, right? Because what was taken from him? Anyone know? The Holy Spirit of God was taken away from him, and the Spirit was given to one who will be king, and that is David, a man who knows that if he stands up for God, God will what? Stand with him. So we read at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 16, the Holy Spirit's removed from Saul, and Saul began to be tormented by an evil spirit. Saul's servants began to look for someone to come and to play music for Saul, to soothe him. And guess who they pick? They pick David, right? So David comes, and when Saul begins to be tormented by an evil spirit, David gets out his lyre, and he starts playing music for Saul, and the evil spirit would leave him. So then we get to chapter 17, and in chapter 17, what we see is we see battle lines being drawn up. We see this valley, and there's an army on either side of the valley. Battle lines are being drawn up between Israel and the Philistines. The Philistines have actually come into Judah. They've come into Israelite territory, into Judah, and they're attacking. And it's in chapter 17 that we meet this man named Goliath. Anybody know anything about Goliath? He's a giant. How tall is he? A little over 9 feet tall, right? Big dude. And many people, when they think of David and Goliath, they don't think about all the history that's loaded behind this battle. We've been talking about this stuff in Sunday school class. Like when Moses first brought Israel to the border of the promised land, they refused to go in. Anybody remember why they refused to go in? There were giants in the land, right? The Israelites said, hey, we look like grasshoppers compared to the people that we see in this land. We read about the desert wanderings, and we're told as you read through that section, they're not supposed to attack the Moabites because the Moabites are their cousins. But then we're told, oh yeah, by the way, the Moabites had giants in their land, and they conquered the giants in their land. They're not supposed to attack the Ammonites. Oh, and because they're your cousins. And by the way, the Ammonites had giants in their land, and the Ammonites conquered the giants in their land. Talk about rubbing it in, right? I mean, you don't want to go in and, okay. So then Moses leads them up the eastern bank of the Jordan River, and they go to war and they fight with the Amorites. What do we find out about the Amorites? There's King Sihon, and then up to the north there's King Og, and Og is said to be the last of the giants in Bashan. That area is called Bashan. Anybody know how tall Og was? Og was 13 feet tall. And they defeat Og. So when Joshua tells of the battles with the inhabitants of the promised land, when he talks about them coming in and defeating the people who live in the promised land, when he kind of sums up the victory, here's what he says. He says, we got rid of all of the giants in Israelite territory, except those who live among the Philistines. That's Joshua 11:22. We got rid of all of the giants, except for the ones who live with the Philistines. So when we read this section, and then we look over, for example, in 2 Samuel, there's later battles that David and his mighty men have with the Philistines, and we learn that the Philistines didn't just have Goliath fighting for them. The Philistines had 5 giants, one of which, we're told, has 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. So here in 1 Samuel 17, the Philistines are taking the battle to Israel, right? And who do they send in? They send in their super soldier, right? They send in their super soldier into battle. And instead of both armies going at it, Goliath wants Israel to send out their champion. So this is going to be one man from the Philistines, one man from Israel. And what would the two do? The two would fight, and that fight would decide which nation would be victorious. And the Philistines had their champion, a giant named Goliath, who was over 9 feet tall. Now, the Israelites didn't have a giant, but they had a man who was a head taller than all the other Israelites. Right? Remember that? He was a man of impressive stature and appearance. He was handsome. He was a successful warrior. Where was he? Who was the giant of Israel? Saul was the giant of Israel, wasn't he? And where was he? He was Israel's champion. And for 40 days, this abomination walks out, Goliath, this abomination walks out into the valley of Elah and blasphemes the God of Israel and ridicules the army of Israel, and no one did a thing about it. So as we read this chapter, we even see Saul, not only is he not going out, what's he trying to do? He's trying to hire somebody to go out, right? He's trying to find somebody to go out and to do his job for him. So when David comes, David just comes to the camp and he's there to deliver provisions. He's there to check on the well-being of his brothers. And he hears that Saul is offering, he hears what Saul is offering to the man who will defeat the giant. Saul is offering his daughter's hand in marriage, and he says that person will never have to pay taxes again. Anybody think that's cool? All right. Anybody in? All right. All right. And I'm sure the perks don't hurt, but you know what? The thing that I think that we see with David over and over again is I think David in his heart looked at the situation and said, someone has to defend the honor of the God of Israel. Someone has to put an end to this giant. And what did David say? I'll do it. Why was this not a big deal for David? Because he knew what? If he stands up for God, God will stand with him, right? Something that stuck out to me this week as I was reading it, you know, David's brothers were there, right? That's why he was going to delivering cheese and he was checking up on his brothers. You remember last week we focused in a little bit on Eliab. Eliab was the oldest of Jesse's sons. He was the one that Jesse and maybe even Samuel thought Eliab's going to be the next king, right? Because he looked the part, he was strong, yet even Eliab is letting this giant blaspheme God. And Eliab stands in judgment of David. Do you see that in the text when you look there? He says this to David. He says, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." And that stuck out to me this week because hasn't David's heart already been judged? Who judged David's heart? And what did God say? Here's a man after my own heart. Yet Eliab looks at David and he says, you have a wicked heart. Why would he say that? Isn't the entire reason why God chose David was that David had a heart for God? Any success that David would have, what would it come from? It would come from the knowledge that if he stands for God, God will what? Stand with him. And one of the lessons we can learn from this section, and we see it over and over and over again in Scripture, is that those who are zealous for God are threatening to those who are not. Did you hear that? Those who are zealous for God are threatening to those who are not. Just like Joseph. You remember the story of Joseph? God speaks to Joseph in a dream. He shares what God told. Who told him it? He didn't come up with it himself, did he? God told him the fact that he would rule over his brothers. He goes to his brothers, hey, this is what God told me. What happened? They threw him in a well and they sold him into slavery, right? And Joseph wasn't being conceited. He was just sharing what God had said to him. Well, David is not being conceited. God chose David as king over all of his brothers. It was God who did the choosing. Yet because he was offended by the choice, Eliab decides David is conceited and that his heart is wicked. But the opposite's true, isn't it? What's seen as conceit, what's really going on there? What's seen as conceit is really the fact that David sticks to his principles, right? What's seen as a wicked heart is really a really deep zeal for God. And Eliab can't see that. So Saul hears that someone is willing. Someone is willing to go out and to fight this giant. So he calls him to the tent. And even Saul sits in judgment of David. So Eliab sits in judgment of David. Saul sits in judgment of David. Saul tells him in verse 33, you're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior since his youth. But then David tells him about how by the power of the Lord, he has killed both lions and bears that have attacked his sheep. And see, from David's perspective, what is this giant? This giant's no different. Because David knows, that if he stands for God, God will stand with him. Saul tries to prepare David by giving him the king's armor, but it just doesn't fit the young man. So instead, David walks out into the valley of Elah with a staff and 5 stones and a sling. And I've read some authors who said, I've read some authors who stand in judgment of David. And they say when it comes to this, it was a lack of faith. Because David chose 5 stones and all he needed was 1. I don't believe that. I believe it was optimistic preparation. Right? Because Goliath was not the only giant in the Philistine army. Goliath was one of 5. You get that? David was prepared to take them all out. And he knew that if he stands up for God, God will stand with him. Somebody else sits in judgment of David. Goliath himself judges David. Because David walks out into that valley, he faces that giant, and we read in verses 42 through 44 how Goliath saw David. It says, he looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. And he said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild beasts. We talked about this a little bit last week, about how translators choose to render these descriptions. I think they're actually meant to be a little bit derogatory. It's not meant to be, oh, he was, glowing in appearance. I think they're actually meant to be derogatory. Goliath isn't looking at David and saying, wow, he's good-looking, healthy guy. I'm offended. Right? I think he is offended because they sent out this small, red-headed little boy who looked like a girl, right? Against a giant. Verse 45 through 47, David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin. This little kid standing there saying this little guy. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day, the Lord will deliver you into my hands. And I'm going to strike you down and cut off your head. This very day, I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and He will give all of you into our hands. Is that bold? And here is where David reveals what makes him atypical. Here's where he reveals what makes him atypical. He reveals what he knows, what he's convinced of. And his conviction is that if he stands up for God, God will stand with him. So how does it happen? David takes that stone and puts it in the sling and lets it fly. And it hits Goliath in the forehead. Goliath falls to the ground. David goes up, uses Goliath's own sword to cut off the giant's head. And if you keep reading, he's walking around camp, and afterward, and how's he walking around camp? He's holding the head, right? The Philistines run. And as they're running, the Israelites follow behind them, and they wind up killing a lot of the enemy's army that day. That's amazing, isn't it? So here are a few things I want us to think about today as we look at this section. David wasn't a typical person. Here's why we're calling the study atypical. David stood out from all the other people around him. We saw in this section that there are a lot of people who sit in judgment of David because he's not like everyone else. His older brother, Saul, Goliath, all of them either misread or underestimated what God could do through David. Yet David knew with all of his heart that if he stood up for God, God would stand with him. And in this section, that's what made David unlike everyone else. So I have a few questions for us today, church. First of all, how many believers do we have here today? Raise your hand. How many believers do we have here today? All right. It's the last one I'm going to ask you to raise your hand on. The rest of them I want you to answer in your mind. How many of you are uncomfortable around people like David? Don't raise your hand, just think about it. How many of you are uncomfortable around people like David? People who are willing to act on faith. People who don't care if the others around them approve or not. People who will do it if they believe God wants it done. How many of you are uncomfortable with that? Maybe you're like his older brother. Maybe you assume ulterior motives. Maybe you're like Saul. Maybe you're cynical. Maybe you say, hey, the Lord be with you, but I'm staying in my tent. Or maybe you're like Goliath. Maybe you're actually offended by the faithful stand someone else is taking. I know that's horrible to say, but maybe you're offended by the faithful stand somebody else is taking for God. And I'll say to you today, if you fit in any of those categories, repent. The challenge for us is to be more like David. Amen? We need to be more like David. We need to be atypical. We need to go against the flow. And if we stand up for God, what will He do? You've heard it several times this morning. Are you convinced of that? Does anybody actually believe that? If you stand up for God, He will stand with you. We're going to go ahead and sing a song this morning. It's going to be our invitation song. And if you want to make a decision for the Lord today, you come forward as we all stand up and as we sing.